Good morning, everybody. It's August 9th, 2026. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. So there's a story breaking out of Tehran right now that sounds like something out of a coup manual, except nobody's calling it a coup, because on paper, the president is still sitting in his chair. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has effectively taken control of the machinery of the Iranian state, blocked the president's own appointments, surrounded the seat of power with its own security perimeter. And now, just days ago, the supreme leader himself reportedly told that same president, if you want to quit, go ahead. Quit, I won't stop you. That's not a government functioning normally. That's a government that has been quietly hollowed out from the inside while the world was busy watching the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to talk about how the IRGC pulled this off, why President Pezeshkian has been reduced to a man threatening to resign just to get anyone to listen to him, what this means for the war with the United States and Israel, and why a regime that Washington claims already went through a change in power is now more militarized than at any point in its history. This is the story of a government that lost control of its own military, and a military that decided it didn't need permission anymore. So let's set the scene, because you need to understand exactly what triggered this. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian tried to do something that should be one of the most basic functions of any head of state. He tried to appoint a new intelligence minister. That's it. That's the whole ask. Iran had gone without one since March, after the previous minister was killed. So Pezeshkian puts forward candidates, including former Defense Minister Hossein Degin, a man with real credibility inside the system. And every single name gets rejected, not by parliament, not through some formal constitutional process, but by one man, IRGC Chief Commander Ahmad Vahidi, who told people around him that under wartime conditions, every critical and sensitive leadership post in the country needs to be selected and run directly by the Revolutionary Guard until further notice. Think about what that sentence actually means. That's not a general offering an opinion. That's the commander of a military organization, telling the elected president of a country that he no longer gets to pick his own cabinet. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. This wasn't a one-off veto. According to reporting from Iran International, which has developed some of the most consistent sourcing inside Iran's fractured wartime leadership, the Guard has now blocked a whole string of Pezeshkian's appointments and decisions, and it has physically built a security perimeter around the core of power in Tehran. A so-called military council made up of senior IRGC officers is now controlling who gets access to the center of decision-making, including access to the new supreme leader himself. Pezeshkian has reportedly tried repeatedly to get an urgent meeting with Khamenei and simply couldn't get through. Not because Khamenei was busy, because the people around him decided he doesn't need to hear from the president right now. Now, if you're just tuning into this story for the first time, you might be asking, wait, didn't Trump already say Iran went through a regime change? And yeah, he did say that back when the ceasefire narrative was being pushed hard in the spring. But here's the truth that's emerged since then. There wasn't a regime change in the sense of one government falling and another one rising. What happened was more like an internal transplant. The old heart of the regime got ripped out by Israeli and American strikes, and the IRGC, being the only organ in the body with a functioning nervous system left, just took over the pumping. Let's walk through how that actually happened, because the sequence matters. Back in February, the war opens with a joint Israeli-American campaign that goes after the top of Iran's command structure directly. On March 17th, Ali Larijani, who had just become Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council days earlier, is killed. He's replaced almost immediately by Mohammad Bagher Zolghadr, and that single substitution tells you everything about where power was already shifting. Because Zolghadr isn't a diplomat or a career bureaucrat, he's an IRGC figure through and through, and his appointment reflected what analysts were already calling the paramountcy of the Guard over the political and clerical establishment and how Iran makes decisions during this war. One day earlier, on March 18th, the intelligence minister at the time, a cleric named Esmail Khatib, is killed in an Israeli strike. His post is now sat vacant for basically the entire rest of the year, which is the vacancy Pezeshkian was trying and failing to fill in the story we just walked through. Then it gets even more brutal. In early April, the head of the IRGC's own intelligence organization, Majid Kademi, a man who had survived decades inside the security apparatus, is assassinated in a strike on April 6th. His position, also still vacant. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, on February 28th, Mohammad Pakpour, who was commanding the entire IRGC at the time, is also killed in an airstrike. He gets replaced by Ahmad Vahidi, the same Vahidi who is now, according to multiple reports, the single most powerful man inside Iran not wearing a turban. You see the pattern here. Every time Israel or the US takes out a senior figure, whoever replaces them tends to be more hardline, more purely IRGC, and less connected to the old clerical political balance that used to define how the Islamic Republic actually functioned. That's not an accident of who happened to be available. That's what happens when you decapitate an organization repeatedly during wartime. The people who end up running things are the ones who were already embedded in the machinery of force, because they're the only ones left standing. And because in a state of emergency, the people holding weapons naturally start making the decisions. And then there's the supreme leader situation itself, which honestly sounds like something out of a thriller. Ali Khamenei, who had run Iran since 1989, is killed during the war, and his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, gets elevated to supreme leader on March 8th, just days after his father's death. Mojtaba was considered more hawkish and more repressive than his father going in, which is saying something. President Trump publicly said he'd consider that appointment unacceptable. It happened anyway. But here's the detail that matters for our story today. Mojtaba was reportedly injured in the same wave of strikes that killed his father. An Iranian official told a British paper that nobody actually knows the true extent of his condition, whether he's fully functioning, how much control he has over the war effort, because information about him is so tightly controlled that even senior commanders say they get no real updates. One analyst, writing for Forbes, described the whole situation bluntly, calling Mojtaba's rise a sign that the Guard was consolidating power behind what he called a pliant figurehead. A figurehead. That's the word being used about the actual supreme leader of Iran by people who study this region for a living. So now you've got a picture forming. You've got a president in Pezeshkian who has no military background and limited independent power. You've got a supreme leader in Mojtaba Khamenei whose own health and control are genuinely uncertain even to people close to him. And you've got Ahmad Vahidi and the Revolutionary Guard sitting in the middle of that vacuum, and vacuums, especially wartime vacuums, always get filled by whoever has the guns and the operational control on the ground. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how collapsing chains of command behave in every country that's ever gone through this. Now let's talk about what Pezeshkian actually tried to do about it, because the man has not been sitting quietly. Back in March, he went on video and apologized publicly for what he called fire-at-will attacks carried out by Iran's armed forces, which is a remarkable thing for a sitting president to say out loud, essentially admitting that his own military was acting outside of coordinated control. Weeks later, reports emerged that Pezeshkian had directly confronted senior commanders, accusing Vahidi and another commander named Ali Abdullahi of acting unilaterally and pushing escalation through strikes on neighboring countries, especially strikes on infrastructure that Pezeshkian believed were destroying any remaining chance at a ceasefire. He reportedly told people in that meeting that those policies were steering the Islamic Republic toward what he called a huge catastrophe, and he warned that Iran's economy would not survive a prolonged war, that without a ceasefire, the whole thing could collapse within 3 weeks to a month. Now, whether that specific timeline was exactly right or not, the man was clearly panicking about the economic trajectory of his own country, and he had good reason to. And what was his one piece of leverage in all of this? Resignation. According to a relative of the supreme leader who spoke to Iranian media, Pezeshkian has reportedly threatened to resign so many times during policy disputes that the exact number being floated around Tehran is 28 separate times. The presidency has denied that specific number, and Pezeshkian himself went on television and said flatly that he has no plans to voluntarily leave his position, that he's fully coordinated with the military, and he will stand firm. But here's the thing about a threat you use 28 times. Eventually it stops being a threat and it just becomes background noise. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. Just this past week, multiple Israeli media outlets, citing sources inside Tehran, reported that Supreme Leader Khamenei effectively told Pezeshkian that if he wants to resign again, go ahead. He'll accept it this time. One senior cleric described it almost like watching someone's last bargaining chip get taken off the table in front of everyone. The president's only weapon, according to that source, was always the threat to walk. And what happened this week was Mojtaba Khamenei taking that weapon away from him entirely, essentially telling him to go ahead and try it and see what happens. That same reporting says Khamenei has thrown his full support behind Vahidi, specifically on decisions related to the war and to negotiations with Washington, which means the president of Iran has effectively been cut out of the loop on the two most important issues facing his own country right now. And it's not just Vahidi acting alone either. There's a pattern developing around Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, the man technically responsible for running diplomacy on behalf of the government. Both Pezeshkian and the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, reportedly believe Araghchi has stopped acting like a cabinet minister implementing government policy and started acting more like a personal aide to Vahidi, coordinating directly with the Guard's commander and acting on his direction without even informing the president first. Pezeshkian has apparently told people close to him that he'll remove Araghchi if that continues. But ask yourself this. If the president can't even get his own intelligence minister appointed, how much actual authority does he have to fire a sitting foreign minister who's operating with the backing of the most powerful military figure in the country? Now let's zoom out for a second, because there's a structural reason this was almost inevitable, and it goes back to a decision made before this war even started. Iran's former security chief, Ali Larijani, the same man who was later killed in March, had reorganized the IRGC into autonomous regional headquarters. Not a single centralized chain of command running through Tehran's civilian government, but separate regional commands that answer directly to the supreme leader, and are specifically empowered to make their own decisions, independent of the civilian leadership in the capital. At the time, that probably looked like smart wartime decentralization, the kind of thing you'd do to make sure a single strike on Tehran couldn't cripple your whole command structure. And it worked, in a sense. Even with massive strikes hitting the capital and killing senior leadership again and again, the IRGC kept functioning, kept operating the naval forces that maintained a blockade posture in the Strait of Hormuz, kept its regional proxy networks moving. But decentralization is a double-edged sword. Once you build a military that's structured to operate independently of civilian oversight during a crisis, you shouldn't be surprised when it keeps operating independently of civilian oversight, once the crisis becomes the new normal. The IRGC now has training and mobilization capacity that reportedly exceeds 220,000 individuals when you count its coordination units, its ideological political structures, and the besieged militia network underneath it. That's not a faction within the government anymore. In a lot of practical ways, that's the government. And the international community has noticed, even if it took its time getting there. Back in February, just days before the second wave of joint Israeli-American strikes, the European Union formally designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, freezing its assets and imposing financial restrictions across every EU member state. Trinidad and Tobago followed with its own designation in April. And in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer promised to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist group, which Parliament followed through on using new powers under a national security law passed this year. Iran's response to some of this international pressure was almost theatrical. After Washington's own designation moves, the Iranian government formally declared U.S. Central Command, the American military command responsible for the entire Middle East region, a terrorist organization right back, and members of Iran's parliament showed up to their next session, all wearing the same green military pants in a show of solidarity with the Guard, chanting the same old slogans about America that Iranian hardliners have been chanting since 1979. It's a strange kind of political theater, an elected legislature dressing itself up in the uniform aesthetic of the very military faction that's currently squeezing the civilian government out of power, almost like the parliament decided, if you can't beat them, dress like them. So now let's bring this back to the war itself, because none of this power struggle is happening in a vacuum. It's happening while Iran is trying to negotiate its way out of a conflict that started in February and has already cost the country enormously. Just this past week, President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that he had called off what he described as the biggest planned attack on Iran since World War II. Only after Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar all personally called him and asked him to hold off. Trump's language here is worth paying attention to, because he wasn't soft about it. He said Iran is now getting what he called a last chance before decapitation, that if this round of talks doesn't produce a real agreement, there won't be another opportunity after it. The talks themselves are reportedly focused on two things. First, reopening the Strait of Hormuz to normal shipping, something Trump said could theoretically happen within a day if both sides agreed. And second, and this is the bigger one, the actual denuclearization of Iran, which Trump acknowledged would take considerably longer to sort out. Iran's foreign ministry, for its part, publicly denied that any direct negotiations with Washington were even happening, which prompted Trump to call the Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous on social media, essentially accusing them of secretly negotiating through intermediaries in Oman while publicly pretending there was no contact at all with the United States. And here's where the economic squeeze becomes the real story underneath the diplomatic one. Trump has maintained what amounts to a counter-blockade on Iranian ports this entire time, stating flatly that nothing gets through to Iran unless the United States wants it to, and that nothing will get through unless there's either a deal or what he called total surrender. Before this war, ships moved freely through the Strait of Hormuz. Now Iran insists on controlling passage through the strait and charging fees for it, something Washington has flatly refused to accept. And Tehran has reportedly been forcing vessels to hug the Iranian coastline rather than take normal shipping routes, which the U.S. and its allies view as an attempt to assert de facto sovereignty over international waters. Iran's government spokesperson claimed a deal was close on managing Hormuz jointly with Oman, which sits on the other side of that narrow waterway. Whether that actually happens, or is just another stalling tactic, remains to be seen, but you can see why Pezeshkian was so panicked about the economy back in March. A country that can't move oil through its own primary export route, while simultaneously fighting a war on multiple fronts, is a country burning through its reserves at a pace that simply cannot be sustained indefinitely, regardless of what the military faction running the war wants to believe. Let's stay on the economic piece for one more minute, because I don't think people outside Iran fully appreciate how much of this power struggle is actually a fight about money disguised as a fight about military strategy. Oil is Iran's lifeline. It always has been. And the Strait of Hormuz isn't just some abstract shipping lane on a map. It's the single narrowest choke point through which a massive share of the entire world's oil and gas has to physically pass. Before this war, roughly a fifth of global oil consumption moved through that strait on any given day. When Trump's administration effectively counter-blockaded Iranian ports, and Iran responded by trying to assert its own control over passage through Hormuz, both sides were essentially fighting over who gets to decide whether that choke point stays open or closed. And every single day that fight drags on, Iran's own oil exports, the primary source of hard currency keeping the government, and by extension the military funded, keep taking a hit. Oil prices actually fell globally the moment Trump announced he was calling off the planned strikes, which tells you the market itself was pricing in serious disruption risk. So when Pezeshkian warned back in March that the economy could collapse within 3 weeks to a month without a ceasefire, he wasn't being dramatic for effect. He was looking at real numbers, real reserves, real strain on a currency that has been in freefall for years, even before this war started. And that's exactly the pressure that makes a figure like Vahidi's position so complicated. He can win every argument inside the military council. He can block every appointment he wants, but he cannot personally print oil revenue out of thin air. And eventually, even the most hardline commander in Tehran has to reckon with the fact that an empty treasury doesn't care how many titles you hold. There's also a piece of the story worth mentioning about how Iran has tried to project strength even while this internal power struggle plays out, because it hasn't just been about the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen declared their own blockade posture in the Red Sea around the same time, forcing multiple Saudi-operated oil tankers to divert entirely around the African continent, adding roughly 2 weeks to their journeys just to avoid the risk. That's a proxy move, straight out of the exact playbook Iran has relied on throughout this entire war, using aligned militias to apply pressure in places where Iran itself can't directly project power anymore because its own navy and air defenses have been so thoroughly degraded. It's a reminder that even while Tehran's civilian government is being quietly pushed to the margins internally, the broader IRGC aligned network across the region hasn't stopped functioning. If anything, the Guard leaning harder on its regional proxies, while its grip on the home government tightens simultaneously, tells you exactly where its priorities sit, not on rebuilding a functioning civilian state. On maintaining leverage everywhere it possibly can, all at once, using whatever tools are still in working order. Before we go any further, if you're finding this breakdown useful for actually understanding what's happening inside Iran right now instead of just watching headlines fly by, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment with what you think is really going on here, and subscribe if you want to keep tracking this story as it develops, because this is moving fast and it's about to get faster. Now let's talk about something else that's been quietly happening while all of this political drama plays out, because it connects directly to why the IRGC feels so confident overruling its own civilian government right now. Remember, this is a military organization that, despite everything, despite losing its top commander, despite losing its intelligence chief, despite losing the man running its own internal intelligence protection organization, managed to keep the Strait of Hormuz effectively contested for months. It managed to keep proxy networks functioning across the region even as its state sponsor was getting hammered from the air. That's the kind of operational resilience that breeds internal confidence, maybe overconfidence, inside an organization like the IRGC. When you're the one part of the government that never stopped functioning through the worst military campaign your country has faced in decades, you start to believe you're the only part of the government that deserves to make decisions. And functionally, in Tehran right now, that belief has basically become policy. There's also a piece of this that's specifically about the succession itself. Mojtaba Khamenei's own legitimacy inside the system was never fully secured the way his father's was. His father spent decades building loyalty brick by brick, reportedly knowing individual mid-level commanders by name, according to people who studied him closely, building a network of personal allegiance that ran deep into the ranks. Mojtaba didn't have decades. He had days because he inherited the position in the middle of an active war, while reportedly still recovering from injuries sustained in the same strike that killed his father. That's an incredibly fragile foundation to build absolute religious and political authority on. So when the IRGC effectively runs the country day to day while Mojtaba remains the symbolic head, that's not really a betrayal of the system from the Guard's perspective. From their perspective, they're the ones holding the whole structure together while the new leader gets his footing, assuming he ever fully does. Whether that's true or whether it's a convenient story the Guard tells itself to justify taking over, honestly, at this point, probably doesn't even matter anymore. because the practical result looks identical either way. So here's the part where we connect all of this together, because there's a bigger pattern sitting underneath every single detail we just walked through. What you're watching in Iran right now isn't really a story about one rejected cabinet appointment or one resignation threat that finally got called. It's a demonstration of what happens to any government at all, when it tries to fight a sustained existential war using a chain of command that was never designed to survive that kind of pressure. Civilian governments are built for negotiation, for balancing competing interests, for slow-moving legitimacy that comes from elections and public consent. Militaries are built for exactly one thing: executing decisions fast under threat. When a country gets hit hard enough for long enough, those two systems start to pull apart, and the one built for speed and force almost always wins the tug of war. Because during a crisis, speed and force are the only currencies that actually matter on the ground. Pezeshkian isn't losing to Vahidi because Vahidi is smarter or more popular. He's losing because in a country under sustained military pressure, the person controlling the guns will always eventually outleverage the person controlling the paperwork. And here's the uncomfortable question that follows from that, the one nobody in Tehran wants to say out loud. If the Revolutionary Guard is already overruling presidential appointments, already blocking access to the supreme leader, already dictating foreign policy through its own coordinated channel with the foreign minister, at what point does the title of president stop meaning anything at all inside that system? Because right now, functionally, Pezeshkian looks less like the head of the Iranian government and more like a very well-dressed spokesperson for decisions that are being made somewhere else entirely. And the scary part, if you're sitting in Tehran and you actually care about the long-term stability of the Islamic Republic as an institution, rather than just winning this particular war, is that a government run by committee between a barely established religious successor and a hardline military commander who answers to no one but himself is not a recipe for stability. It's a recipe for exactly the kind of internal fracture that ends up doing more damage to a regime than any foreign airstrike ever could. Regimes rarely collapse from a single external blow. They collapse when the internal structure holding them together quietly stops functioning, and everyone on the inside is too afraid or too busy protecting their own position to say so out loud. There's also a very real possibility that this internal power struggle is exactly why Iran suddenly seemed so eager to reopen back-channel talks with Washington through Oman, even while publicly denying it. Because if you're Ahmad Vahidi, and you now control the negotiating posture of an entire country during wartime, the last thing you want is an economic collapse happening on your watch. The exact collapse that Pezeshkian was warning about back in March. A collapsing economy doesn't just hurt ordinary Iranians, though it absolutely does hurt them first and worst. A collapsing economy also strips away the resources the IRGC itself needs to keep its own networks funded, its own regional proxies supplied, its own internal security apparatus paid and loyal. So even a military faction that has zero interest in civilian oversight still has every incentive in the world to avoid total economic freefall, because an unpaid, unfunded security state is a security state that stops being able to enforce its own control. That's probably a big part of why, even with Vahidi now holding what multiple reports describe as final say on decisions related to the United States, Iran hasn't simply doubled down on total rejection of negotiations. It's threading a needle, trying to project total defiance publicly while quietly keeping every diplomatic channel open in private, through Oman, through Qatari mediators, through indirect exchanges between Araghchi and American officials. What happens next probably depends less on Pezeshkian and more on whether Vahidi and the military council around Mojtaba Khamenei conclude that a deal, even an uncomfortable one, keeps the Guard's own machinery funded and intact longer than continued war would. If that calculation shifts toward negotiation, you'll likely see Araghchi suddenly empowered to move faster in those Oman-mediated talks, not because the president gained any authority back, but because it will suit the interests of the people who actually hold the authority now. And if that calculation shifts the other way, if the Guard decides that maintaining maximum pressure and betting on Trump being politically distracted by the American midterm elections in November gives them more leverage, then expect Pezeshkian to keep getting boxed further and further out of a process that technically still bears his country's name on every document. It's worth stepping back and comparing this to how these things have historically played out in other countries, because Iran isn't the first state to run this exact experiment. Whenever a civilian government fights a war it doesn't have the institutional muscle to sustain, and the military ends up being the only functioning arm of the state left standing, you tend to see one of two outcomes. Either the civilian leadership manages to reassert control once the acute crisis passes, usually by rebuilding legitimacy through some kind of political win. The public can actually feel, or the arrangement calcifies, and the military faction simply never hands power back, because why would it? Once an organization tastes direct control over foreign policy, cabinet appointments, and access to the head of state, voluntarily stepping back down to a subordinate role again is historically the exception, not the rule. Right now, everything about the reporting coming out of Tehran points toward the second outcome. Vahidi isn't behaving like a commander managing a temporary wartime emergency. He's behaving like a man who has concluded this is simply how the country is going to be run from now on. Ultimatum or no ultimatum, ceasefire or no ceasefire. Either way, watch the intelligence minister seat. That empty chair, the one Pezeshkian couldn't fill because Vahidi rejected every single candidate, is probably the single clearest indicator you're going to get of who's actually steering this country day to day. The moment someone finally does get seated in that role, pay very close attention to whose name it is, and more importantly, whose approval that name needed before it ever reached the president's desk. Because in Tehran right now, that's not a formality. That's the whole ballgame. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think Pezeshkian survives as a functioning president through the rest of this year? Or is this the slow public unraveling of civilian authority inside the Islamic Republic altogether? Do you think Vahidi and the Guard actually want to deal with Washington? Or are they just buying time while they consolidate everything they can get their hands on internally? And if you found this breakdown genuinely useful for understanding what's actually happening behind the headlines, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this with somebody who's been asking you what's really going on in Iran right now, and subscribe so you don't miss the next update, because this story is very far from finished. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next one.